July 1945, Hull, Yorkshire, and Ernst Scholz felt, for the first time in months, able to relax after gardening and dinner of and carrots, potatoes and chicken. Constable Pickering turned on the radio, on which there was a drama, and Mrs. Pickering brought them both tea. When the radio turned to events on the continent, about raids in Holland and Germany and along the Swiss border, he looked across to Ernst, who was staring at the wireless. "Is this true?" Ernst asked the policeman. "Are there attacks in Germany, even now?" For there were people he knew, good people, people who had no choice to free their land but who were equally against the Nazi regime, who spent their days resisting what that could. The Scholz neighbors down their street, the Mullers, had been arrested and taken away by the SS for interfering with communication lines. "Let us not worry about that," Constable Pickering told Ernst. From his jacket he took out a pack of playing cards. Mrs. Pickering got to her feet, knowing what was coming. She knew all her husband's magic tricks, and was glad he had a new audience. In the morning, a message arrived by a boy on a bicycle who propped it against the garden gate and hurried up the front path. He hammered on the door, which was opened by Mrs. Pickering, still in her night clothes, hair in curlers and under a hairnet. "The sergeant told me to tell you that you must return to the station," he told Constable Pickering, who appeared beside his wife. "He says you must bring the German boy with you." And the boy looked past the couple, trying to get a glimpse of this German boy, who had piqued his interest on the cycle ride down. "There is no one by the name of Lucino Ashby living at Downton Abbey, Yorkshire," Sergeant Bott told Constable Pickering. Ernst was sitting in a chair opposite Stanley Pickering's desk, who got to his feet when the sergeant came in. Bott glared at Ernst, eyes narrowing. "Why would she give this as her address?" Ernst asked. "Sir?" he added. Bott gave him an even graver scowl. "She might have been a maid." "Moved on." But Ernst shook his head. "Will you look at this letter, please?" It was the one he had showed to Constable Pickering the day before. Yesterday, he had been a starving waif of a child, a refugee, no bath for 3 days and in clothes stolen from 2 washing lines in Rotterdam. Wilfred Bott said, reading the letter. Then he glared at Ernst. "She talks about uranium-235. Is that a common thing for maids in a big house to speak about?" Ernst pushed. "You have a good point," said Constable Pickering. "Someone would know. We can go back to the station and make a telephone call." But Bott put a hand out. "That's if you're not a spy," he told Ernst. "Coming across from Holland? A sob story of missing parents? Technical grade information about uranium?" But Ernst shook his head. "How can I be?" he asked the sergeant. "I come here, with nothing, except the story I found out about a week ago. I have no weapons. I have no—" He looked down. "I have nothing," he said at last. For if he went back, if he was sent away, not being believed, there was no home for him to go back to. Even if he found somewhere, his world was in turmoil, his country was in ruins. No order, no law. He would be lucky to survive. "I would like to go on my own," he told the policeman. "I would like to find out about her, rather than have my arrival announced to the family at the house." He closed his eyes, his weariness coming back. He was finding it hard to explain. "Or you can stay with Mrs. Pickering and I, for a few days. We never had children of our own, you see, and you were no trouble." Bott's expression changed. He couldn't help but believe the boy. Only someone desperate would turn up in the country now victorious against his own. With such a story, it was bound to raise questions, ones which a spy would be keen to avoid. Pickering was still looking at Ernst as the boy worked it out. "Good. That's good if I am no trouble," Ernst told him. "Then yes, that would be very good of you, Constable Pickering. When I do get to Downton Abbey, I would also like to be alone. If you were to accompany me, perhaps people would think I am in trouble, that I am arrested." He looked between the policemen. "I am not in trouble for coming, am I?" "Under normal circumstances, probably," Sergeant Bott thought to himself. And even he had, though that Pickering had been mad to take him home. But even in this boy's company, he couldn't help but feel sorry for him. "I will stay with you, Policeman Pickering," Ernst told him, and Bot gave a nod. "And we can help you get to the bottom of this, for you, for your mother, and for my blessed constable, Stanley Pickering," Bot concluded, slapping the man on the shoulder. "Now, who's for a nice cup of tea?" 88,888,888 September 1925. It took a good deal of effort for Thomas Barrow to get out of bed that morning. Already, he had heard noises from the women's end of the corridor, excited laughing and giggling. Somehow, it made his mood feel lower. There were no jobs, or none he wished to take. Too low pay, or too much hard work. His lordship and Carson were working too hard to get rid of him. And there was Milo. He hadn't heard, even in passing, whether it was she was coming that day or not. Thomas swung his legs out of bed, and got up, his legs feeling old and wearisome. How much he would like to stay in bed that morning. Even his offer of help had been rebuffed. Carson must know he was being cruel, and he had done it all the more. It was with supreme effort that Thomas got downstairs in his Sunday best. And even when Mr. Molesley mentioned he was to have a buttonhole, Carson was reluctant to give him one. "You don't look full of the joys of life," he told Barrow, as Thomas turned from his office doorway. He turned back, fixing a grin to his lips. "And why might you suppose that, Mr. Carson?" Downton's butler gave him a brief stare, then shook his head. "No reason. You haven't got what other men have, that was all." "It is understandable you are upset. I have a wife, Mr. Carson, and it says here she accepts yours and Mrs. Hughes' kind invitation to the wedding." The acceptance letter was on Carson's table. Thomas could just make out her messy handwriting, and to-the-point message. "I don't think." Barrow passed the card over. "Carson, read it." One caterpillar of an eyebrow raised. "But, I mean," Carson protested, "not in the same sense, excuse me." But then Carson's patience failed, and he took a step towards Thomas Barrow. "You have no heart. You married that girl." "And what do you mean by that, Mr. Carson?" Because Thomas would not, and never would, back down over Milo. He had meant to sound cocky, accusing, challenging the man to pass comment about Milo. Instead, it came out as angry. Without waiting for a reply, Thomas turned on his heel, and walked out of the butler's office. He hadn't meant to take Milo's letter. Her letter had sounded fine, short but fine. She had told Mrs. Hughes she was coming. That was something. Perhaps Milo had reasoned the reply was enough, and that Mrs. Hughes would tell him. Well, she hadn't. And then there had been Mrs. Patmore, warning him off Andy Parker. Thomas had just wanted to be friends, walk with him, chat, do things he and Jimmy did as friends. Andy was not a one, but he seemed a good young man. At every knockback Thomas had tried to remain positive, but all the world seemed to be changing, and there was no longer a Thomas-shaped hole. It was times like this he wanted to talk to Milo. She seemed to have answers for these sorts of things. Well, she said she was coming up. But Thomas Barrow wished she were staying. 88,888,888. The service had already begun when Milo got to the church, which was full. A few glances from the hall boys and maids, none of whom Milo knew, and she had a place at the end of one of the aisles. No one saw her, save Daisy as she walked beside Mr. Mason as they left the church, but she said nothing, rather, gave Milo a nod and a big Daisy-like smile as she passed. "Shove over," said one of the hall boys, as Milo stood there, looking at the guests, which earned him a clip around the ear from Andy, who was passing, and also gave Milo a nod. She followed the wedding party to the schoolhouse, entering the hall at the back of the room near the fireplace, not lit, as the warmth of the summer had not yet left September. Milo had not meant to avoid the receiving line, but as she had watched as the guests were greeted by Mr. Carson and Mrs. Hughes, Mrs. Carson now, she presumed, before placing the package, a green glass vase in a protective box, neatly wrapped by Eileen. Milo was no good at that sort of thing, and waited as the guests came in. "You look well," Daisy exclaimed, approaching her with enthusiasm. "I am so glad you've come. I've got loads to tell you." Beside her, Mr. Molesley approached. Milo glanced across to see Thomas, but her view was obscured when Miss Baxter came to join them. "Green glass?" asked Daisy, That's unusual. Is it foreign? It means copper has been added, said Mr. Melsley, knowledgeably. Not in this case, said Milo. It's uranium glass. What's that? Asked Daisy, peering at it. It means it will glow in the dark, Mr. Melsley told Daisy. Uranium glass is rare, he added, smiling to Milo. I am impressed, it is very rare. Milo put down the box, and smiled back. It seems like it was a lovely wedding, she told them, then stopped when she noticed Thomas step into view. How pleased Milo was to see him. The others melted away, and then there was just her and him, as there always used to be. To Milo, Thomas seemed a little nervous, vulnerable. Perhaps they could walk later on, perhaps they could talk and he could tell her. Thomas has helped Milo put her distress away, out of her mind. She was recovering from her attack, her fall. Nice to see you, Thomas told her, and put out a hand. Milo took it, and smiled, not seeing Miss Baxter's face as she glanced between hands being held and faces in tune with one another. Thomas, it is nice to see you too. Better than nice, Milo exclaimed. But she broke off as Mr. Carson began his speech. But that was about as far as the niceties went, between Milo and Thomas. For, as Mr. Carson finished, exclamations arose from the visitor who had arrived through the door, carrying his daughter, Lord and Lady Grantham's eldest grandchild, in his arms. All too quickly, Milo slipped Thomas's hand, and took off through the back door, through which she had come. It took a few seconds for Thomas to realize why, which, after half an hour of looking for his wife, was the reason, he figured, that she had managed to get a head start. And all at once the misery he had been suffering, about his job, and the resentment of his colleagues, and missing Milo coalesced into one white-hot mass in his stomach, and he waited until Tom Branson came out of the hall on his own for a moment. Hands, bunched into fists, gripped Branson's coat and he was thrust hard up against the brickwork. Well, thank you, Mr. Branson, Thomas told him, snarling the words into his face. He didn't care if he was caught, nor less if Branson told his in-laws. Thomas would out him for the attack on his wife. What for? Branson spluttered. But the look in his eye told Thomas he knew exactly what was going on. You know what for? Sir, he spat into Tom Branson's face. I just helped the bloody hell she doesn't choose to sit at Downton Abbey's doorstep and starve herself. That's what I hope, he told him, icily. Because if she does, I'll kill you.